Hello and welcome to the final video in my D.A.K Diorama series. In this video, I'll bring together the 1/35 Kubelwagen and the scale 75 Dak figures. You can find a link to these in the description below. For the base of the diorama, I used a 7x5 box frame from a hardware store. The glass was removed and the backing plate was glued into place with PVA. I'm using polystyrene packing foam to build up my groundwork as it's all I had available at the time. Using the main elements for the diorama, I played around until I found a composition I was happy with. The packing polystyrene was glued onto the frame with some PVA glue. Whilst packing polystyrene isn't the best material for a diorama base, it's definitely a cost-effective one. The second, raised section of the diorama was glued on with PVA glue. To give the base some more structure and to make it look nicer for display, I surrounded the polystyrene in 2mm plywood. This was glued on with Mod Podge, which is a type of PVA glue. I used masking tape to hold this in place whilst it dried. I used 1mm sheet styrene to reinforce the retaining wall on the diorama. This was fixed on with VMS superglue. I used a layer of wall filler thinned with water to fill in the gaps around the edges of the diorama and to give me a more stable surface to work on. Once the filler had dried, it was time to start work on the stonework for my diorama. To create the stonework, I used 2mm cork sheet. This was cut into shape and then distressed with my scalpel. I didn't want the stonework to look too uniform, so I made sure the distressing looked different on each stone. It's easy to remove too much, so make sure you check your references when doing something like this to make sure it looks authentic. Each piece of cork stone facing was glued on with PVA glue. When the retaining wall was finished, I mixed up some casting plaster with water. You don't want this too thick as it will act as your mortar and a filler to unify the surface. This was then brushed over the whole construction. Using stippling motions can add some more texture to the stone surfaces, and it's easily sanded and removed if you don't like it. The next step was to add the paved road surface. After looking at some references, I decided the stones on the paved surfaces were a lot less regular than those on the walls. So for this, I cut lots of different sizes out of the cork for the stones. These were then again glued in place with PVA glue. I think the random crazy paving style road surface will also contrast really nicely against the regimented retaining wall. Once the road surface was complete, this was then coated with my mix of plaster and water. It looks like cutting the stone pieces and laying them down was a monotonous task, but really it didn't take very long and it'll look quite effective. Once the plaster had dried, I gave everything a light sand with some 2000 grit sandpaper. Before I started painting the diorama proper, it needed a primer. For this, I used Badger Styron Res Grey. This was sprayed through my 0.2 Harder & Steenbeck Infinity CR at 20 psi. Oh, I almost forgot, we need some pillars. Creating the Doric Pillars in a cost-effective and strong manner was going to always be a challenge. After lots of brainstorming, I came up with a solution. I spent some time at work collecting the plastic tubes that come in refills from till rolls for card machines. I also needed something to sculpt them with, so I decided to use milliput. This is strong, sandable, and gives you plenty of working time. The milliput was mixed thoroughly together. This was then pressed out into sheets and wrapped around the plastic tubing. Once I had smoothed everything out, the milliput was distressed with a stiff old toothbrush. The original idea was that these columns were going to be marble and painted in oils. This is the process that got me to before the painting. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite hack the painting, so I had a change of plan. Either way, the columns needed sanding to make sure they were smooth and mostly cylindrical. I used some coarse sanding sticks for this, and it made light work of the milliput. The columns were primed with Badger Styron Res. This was before I decided I'd bitten off more than I can chew with the painting. The columns were glued together with some styrene pieces and some VMS Flexi 5K CA superglue. The columns were then pressed into place to make sure everything looked okay. The cocktail sticks were a bit of a bodged job, but they held up to the task of keeping them in place. The painting was started with the edge of the base. This was sprayed in a few light coats of Misha Models black primer, thinned with Misha Models thinner. The stonework was given an initial coat with Misha Models Elfenbein. This was built up in several light coats as I didn't want to hide any of the detail that I'd created. For the main stonework, I used several Vallejo colours. I used black, field blue, stencil, German camouflage beige, old wood and brown sand. These were mixed into several stone colours that matched up to some of my references. The colour mixes weren't static, so I can't tell you what they were. I mixed the colours on the fly and picked out different stones in different colours. Once the stone colours had dried, I painted over a thick coat of Wilder Aquiline Dry Earth. I used this to simulate a build-up of dirt between the paving stones. Once the Aquiline Dry Earth had dried, I used a water wipe to wipe away the excess and reveal the stonework underneath. With the painting on the road surface complete, I started to paint the retaining wall. I used most of the colours from before, but stuck with sandy, warmer tones. For the earth behind the retaining wall, I used some casting plaster, VMS acrylic binder and some VMS sand pigments. I mixed coarse pigments A and C together to create a pinky sand tone. I then added some water to liquefy the mix. The acrylic resin binder is really useful here as it sticks everything together, meaning the pigment and plaster mix should be really solid when it's dry. This was then painted over the earth sections of the diorama. I started with a thin wet coat for coverage. This was then followed by a thicker, stodgier mix for texture. Now it's time to add some more depth to the diorama base. The stonework was given an overall wash of raw umber artist oils mixed with VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium. This was followed with a more targeted wash of burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oils. The darker wash was also applied to the groundwork. Despite being a North African diorama, this ruin is set somewhere near the coast, so there is some greenery. For the vegetation on the road surface, I used some AK self-adhesive 2mm summer green tufts. I didn't trust the glue that was on them, so I used PVA glue to fix these into place. These were applied in a random manner to help keep the diorama looking organic. For the second lot of vegetation, I used Fredericus Rex grass tufts. These weren't quite the right shade of green, so I sprayed them with Vallejo olive green to help them blend into the scene much better. These were then fixed in place with PVA glue. I added some smaller tufts around the bigger ones for some variation. Some small tufts were also pressed into the cracks of the stonework. Anyway, let's move back to the pillars. My original attempt at painting these was dreadful, so I decided on a different approach. The columns were attacked with a Dremel with a coarse grade sanding wheel. I'm embarrassed to say I lost the footage of me doing this, but they came out with a nice worn, hewn stone look. To paint the ancient pillars, I used Vallejo stone grey mixed with Michelin Models thinner. Thinning Vallejo with Michelin Models thinners works really nicely and it ends up spraying really smooth. Out of sheer laziness, I didn't prime the pillars. The Vallejo was sprayed straight on top of the milliput. To attach the pillars to the base, I used VMS Flexi 5K CA for dioramas. It's quite a strong glue, so combined with my innovative cocktail stick supports, it should do the job nicely. The pillars, once glued, were given a wash of cobalt blue and burnt sienna artist oils mixed again with VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium. Once that was done, it was time to give a sandy, deserty vibe to the diorama. Firstly, I used a mix of some VMS sand pigments and their enamel binder 2.0. For visual interest, I used several shades of the VMS sand pigments. The pigments were mixed into the enamel binder to make a wash. I then added some odourless thinners to the mix to thin it down even more. The dusty pigment mix was then brushed over the diorama in a random manner. I wanted to emulate sand that had blown up against the wall and blended in with the grass. I used the coarsest grade of VMS sand pigments and built this up around the edges of the wall. The VMS Enamel Binder 2.0 was then dropped onto the pigments to fix them into place. For the areas where I wanted really heavy sand deposits, I mixed up some VMS sand pigments with their enamel binder, with a very high pigment to binder ratio. This mix was then brushed into the corner between the wall and the road. The same mix was stippled in a similar manner around the grass tufts and on the groundwork. Heavy deposits were also brushed around the pillar bases where they would logically accumulate. I mixed up a heavier pigment wash and randomly placed this over the base. This was then blended in with odourless thinners. One of my subscribers, George C.A., keeps reminding me to paint the epaulets on the figures. So here we are, I'm painting the epaulets. I looked at my references and couldn't decide which ones would be most appropriate, so I just went for white piping. For this I used Vallejo stencil. The figures were attached to the base with brass wire. A hole was drilled into one of the feet and the brass wire was glued in with CA. These were then pressed carefully into the base. The Kubelwagen was then dropped into place and the diorama was complete. And there we have it, a Roman-influenced, North African D.A.K diorama. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed already, why not? I've got more great content on the way. Also, don't forget to give the video a like. I also want to give a big shout out to my patrons. You can see who they are in the credits. If you're interested, click on the card above. Anyway, I'll let you watch the end footage and photos in peace. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.